Welcome to the Intentional Leader Podcast presented by Reenergize Professional Coaching. We appreciate you listening in and learning with us. The stories and leadership tips you hear will help you become a great leader. Listen intentionally. Now, to our host, Sean Olson.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this episode of the Intentional Leader Podcast. This is the podcast where you hear the real stories of people just like you who become extraordinary leaders. You'll hear tips and tools from their life that you can apply to your life as a leader to become the best leader you were created to be. When we're intentional as a leader, lives are changed. I'm Sean Olson, your host. I am an author, speaker, business owner, and really just love doing podcasts to get to know incredible people like the guest that we have today. Today, listeners, we are blessed to have with us Lida Citroën. Lida is an international author, speaker, and coach. And I love the emphasis of what you do. This phrase, positioning people for success, because life is about our brand and positioning, how you drive those things forward. Lida, it is great to have you on the Intentional Leader Podcast. Welcome.
Thank you so much. And intentional positioning is even better. So, yes.
Exactly. That's the way it takes place. Well, Lida, I know you're familiar with our podcast, and we lead off every show just getting to know our guests a little bit by having you just kind of walk us through some of your professional career. But even in that, the leadership lessons learned along the way. And listeners, I'm excited for you guys to hear about this because she actually is now working in like 30 countries around the world. So the international piece is real. And I want to hear how you got to that type of credibility and brand. So Lida, just kind of walk us through what you've learned on the way.
Sure. So it's a long story. I'll make short. I actually spent 20 years working in corporate, doing what most of us do, right? We get that first job, which if we're good at it, then we get to the next job and we make more money and have more fun and a better title. And then we get recruited away. And that's how 20 years looked for me. Mm-hmm. I was happy. I was doing good work. I was making more and more and more money each time I changed. And I had a really good resume of accomplishments. The thing I really didn't have was a lot of intention. There was no strategy to my career. I just kind of went to the next thing because it made sense. And when the market crashed in the US in 2008, I found myself unemployed like a lot of people. Mm-hmm. And in that moment, decided that I wanted to start a business. And I never wanted to be a business owner. I don't know about you, but I wasn't a risk taker. So I liked a paycheck and PTO and an office somebody else paid to have cleaned. But in that moment, I thought, I've been doing the same thing in the same way for 20 years. What if I did something different? And I had written an ideal job description for myself and realized that I had to start a business to make that happen. Because of where the market was, if you remember 2008, everyone was losing their jobs. Everyone, houses were being foreclosed on. And if you had a job, you were desperate to keep it. So we were constantly looking at how are we positioning ourselves and trying to be more competitive and more relevant. Well, I started a business around personal branding, which was not the term that it is today. Nobody knew what I was talking about.
Right.
But I was helping people position themselves to keep their job, to get a better job, or to find a job. And that really took off. I wish I could say it was strategy and I sketched it out on a cocktail napkin. I think there was a lot of divine intervention, but I was in the right place at the right time. And that was 16 years ago. I started small, doing small coaching projects and writing articles. And then it just sort of exploded internationally. There really wasn't a strategy to it. It just happened, and I went with it.
Yeah. So a thought on that really quick. So I understand everything happened in 2008. Actually, I think that was September 15, 2008. So we're just past an anniversary here and how that took place. As you began to talk to people and you began talking to them about their positioning so they could move forward in their career and stuff, was that just like sidebar conversations at the company you were at? What kind of brought that about that made you think, oh, there's something here?
Great question. I had always done that in my roles. So when I was in-house, I was a chief marketing officer. I was managing director of marketing and public relations. So I was always in those visible roles, managing perception, managing the optics, managing how our products or services were introduced, as well as our people were introduced. So I'd always been coaching the people side, but I became less enamored with the products and the services. So when I started a business, it was focused on people, right? Taking that branding experience, working for big global companies, and saying, what if we use the same process and just applied it to people? And again, 16 years ago, people didn't talk this way.
Right.
So I was constantly explaining this, but it was that idea of helping somebody position themselves to be in the right conversations in the right way with the right people.
Very good. So then you realize, okay, there's something here. This is gaining some traction. I can make a business out of this. I'm curious because you talked about the risk factor. You never thought you'd be doing your own business. And I know entrepreneurs and solopreneurs, some have that risk-taking venture. Others are
Right.
just like, it took me 5 years to start because I was so afraid of it. Because it came naturally and you found something you're already doing, did that minimize that anxiety and risk for you where it was like, hey, you know what? I can do this.
I don't know that was it. When I announced that I was starting a business, I had so many people reach out to me and say, gosh, I've been telling you to do that for years. I knew you should have owned a business. And I didn't hear them. I wasn't receptive to it. I just, in the moment that I was supposed to decide, it became crystal clear. And I really believe that. I believe that opportunities and choice is in front of us. It's when we decide to act on it. And yeah, maybe they had been in the back of my ear all the time telling me I should have my own company, but I wasn't listening because that wasn't what I was interested in. Once I made the commitment, so many folks said, well, are you going to give it a couple of years? Like, how long are you going to try this for?
Right.
It was non-negotiable. I was not going back. Even on my worst year, I don't think about going back. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of freedom that comes into it. It's interesting, people talk about risk and, it's too risky to go in your own business. There's just as much risk in a corporate job, right?
100%.
They can let us go at any time. Another September 1508 can happen. And so sometimes you just have to take it and say, what can I do with this?
Well, there's no job security. I mean, that concept that, once you're hired on, you're set, you can relax. Says who? It doesn't even have to be a recession. It can be a reorg or a manager who wants to go a different direction. I mean, there's no such thing as job security. So I'm always advocating, even if I'm working for people, coaching them that are inside companies, which is a lot of my work, you're still thinking like an entrepreneur. Think like a business owner when you go to the office every day or you work with your team. Yeah. It's a different mindset.
That's great. So you start the business, it begins to gain some traction. You said that it went international relatively quickly. Yeah. I know that's something that most people are afraid of. And I'll even put myself in this boat, right? Like, so for me right now, we're in the US and we're dabbling in Canada, but we're not crossing any oceans or anything yet. What created those opportunities to go international and how did you take advantage of it?
I think being really visible myself. I love social media, so I've always been very active. LinkedIn is my home base for social media. And so I started attracting a lot of connections and followers and contacts that were overseas. My parents were European. They came to this country from Europe. So the accents and different cultures, I grew up with that. It felt so natural to have a conversation with a client in France or India or the UAE or Canada. And I understood going in that, I have to treat this differently because not everybody thinks like Americans do.
Right.
So I kind of had a predisposition to it. And then I just started loving the diversity of it. The nuance keeps me learning and keeps my work fresh. So I would hate for that part to disappear, and I hope it never does. A lot of my big clients are outside of the U.S.
Nice.
Yeah.
So I know you have become an accomplished author. You have 7 books now. We're going to talk about your most recent one, your 7th one shortly. What got you into the authoring bits, and to have 7 of them? Obviously, it's become a passion.
Yeah, I will admit the first book I wrote is because I wanted to be a speaker. I'd always been, an extrovert, and I learned the craft of speaking, because just because you can open your mouth doesn't mean you know how to do a presentation. You know that. And a lot of people were asking me, well, do you have a book or something that we can do back of room sales? And I thought, well, no. They said, you really should have a book. So I admit my first book was kind of the book I thought I had to write. And I wrote it fast.
Yeah.
It was a good book. I mean, it sold for years. And I redid the book completely differently a couple of years ago because it really needed an overhaul. But I've always been a writer. I've written for military.com, which is a internet publication owned by Monster for the military community. I've written for them for 12 years. I've been a freelance writer. I love to put words on paper and tell stories. So writing books is easy for me, but the prompt is the challenge. I've always been able to find the prompt, but I actually thought after my last book that maybe I was going to call it done until the new idea came. And then it was obvious. I had to write that one. Yeah.
Good. So I know a lot of our listeners are entrepreneurs. They've thought about writing books, or maybe they have written that first one. With the growth of your business, how much of it would you attribute to being a published author?
It's a great question, because a lot of people think, like I did back in the day, that you had to write a book to give you some type of legitimacy or credibility. Self-publishing is a phenomenal opportunity today. It used to have a stigma.
Right.
And I know when I published 3 of my books were self-published. 3? Yeah, 4. 4 of my books, apologies. It's kind of like my children. How many do I have? Now I know how many I have, but when you self-publish, it used to be kind of frowned upon. Today, it's a way to get a book to market fast. You have total control. And a lot of my clients think, well, I've got a story I should write a book. There's a real reason you write a book, and it isn't necessarily from you. It's because of what the market needs, right? So yeah, I think it's great opportunities today. Publishers are very different. I've worked with 2 traditional publishers now. Totally different experiences. And, for somebody interested in writing a book, if the market needs what you have to put out and the timing is right and you've got the story and the credibility, absolutely go for it. You don't get rich off of books unless you write Harry Potter. We do it because they are marketing tools. But I also look at it as a way to get the message out to a community that I sometimes just can't get in front of. My first military book was written for that. I was being asked to do all this work, and I was doing it all pro bono, and I didn't have time to go to all these installations around the country to teach service members how to get out of the military. I thought if I put it all in a book and I could get it to them, then they'll have the tools for $20 instead of having to fly me in and think about those costs.
Fantastic. Great. I love that. So your most recent book, the 7th one, is titled The New Rules of Influence. What I like about that title is it means that there were old ones, but they're no longer necessarily as effective. But just kind of give us a general premise of the new rules of influence, and we'll talk about some of the key points.
Sure. So the New Rules of Influence really dispels a lot of what maybe I know I was taught growing up, which is that to have influence meant you got to a certain level of seniority in a company and you had to have this thing called executive presence. You had to sound a certain way, you had to dress a certain way, and you had to have gravitas. And it worked for a while. And there have been some great books that teach those premises. But what it didn't solve for is people who didn't identify with that model, right? What if you aren't an executive? What kind of presence are you supposed to have? What if you're junior to the organization, you don't have the leadership title or the rank, but you have something to say? And, the picture of executive presence was always, a man in a red power tie.
Right.
I remember my sons growing up, when they got their first suit, they said, well, we need to get red ties. And I'm like, why red? It doesn't go with your skin color. And they said, because that's supposed to be power. And there was that narrative that just doesn't work for most of us. And especially internationally, it doesn't work. So I thought it was time for some new rules.
Good. So walk us through what some of those high-level rules are.
Well, there's 10 in the book, and trust me, I could have come up with 50, but that's really hard to chew on. And the 10 rules are organized in 4 sections. So the book walks you through, first of all, talking about executive presence and why it doesn't really work anymore in the classic way for most of us. But then it encourages you in the first section to think about, why do you want to have influence? Is it just to get money, just to get to the next job title? That's not what we're talking about here. If you really want to drive change, if you want to build community, you want to make an impact, you're going to have to be courageous. And the first rule in that section is understanding what courage is. This is not for the faint of heart. This is not about scripting messages and buying a fancy suit and trying to be somebody you're not. This is about really being yourself, and that's going to be hard and scary. So that's the first step. And then we talk about being real. We today, and I think a lot of this changed in the pandemic, right? We look for people who are real, who aren't going to sugarcoat it, who aren't going to spin it. Just give me the truth. Just tell me what I need to know, and speak from your heart. That's also in there. And then the third is being credible. If you're not credible, I won't trust you. And credibility starts with knowing what your values are. So it's a lot of hard work. That first section is really hard, but think about it. If you're going to have influence, you've got to know yourself and why you're coming into this conversation. So that's the first section. Then we move into, who do you want to influence? And I love when someone says everyone. Right. How big is your marketing budget? Because everyone takes a lot of money, right? But that's not realistic. But who are the people you want to serve? Who's your community? Who's your tribe? And it may not be people who look like you or come from your background, and that's okay. You're going to have to learn everything you can about them. That was my experience with the military. I didn't come from the military. I didn't have anybody in my family or friends who had been in the military, but I felt a calling to help these men and women coming out of uniform understand how to be a civilian again. I had to learn everything I had to learn, and I'm still learning, 15 years later. And then in that section, I also talk about inclusivity, and I got some eye rolls when people first saw that I was going there. But I think if you're going to have influence, you have to have everybody in the room. We know so many people who've got the title, right? Yep. But they eliminate voices. And that keeps them safe, right? It keeps them validated in their own head, but they're not getting the full picture. And how do we embrace people who disagree with us? How do we embrace people who are different from us and bring them into the conversation? We still get to have our own opinions, but being able to lead from a place of a service and an inclusive mindset. Those are the first 2 really big anchors. And then we move into how and where. How are you going to influence people? You have to be consistent, right? I don't want to see a different version of Sean Olson on LinkedIn than I meet when I'm doing the podcast, because that will breed skepticism. So there has to be consistency, and we have to be flexible and agile and all these kinds of things. And then, we got to be visible. I can't be influenced by you. I can't understand your vision and mission if I don't see you and hear you. So I'm just summarizing kind of generally, but that's the narrative that the book takes. And we finish with talking about measuring and monitoring, because if we're going to put this much work in, we got to know that it's doing something. But a lot of influence is that ripple effect. I may have influenced someone who goes off and does something so amazing and tremendous, and it never comes back to me, but I trust that that's what's happening. So yes, there are KPIs, but there are also things that we're not going to see. And that's part of the beauty of influence.
Absolutely. I love that. And I love the fact that you've got to start with yourself, right? And the courage aspect and understanding where you are, and the credibility, which the way you're using credibility there kind of even goes to that character level a little bit. Yeah. And, we have to know who we are. We have to know what we're trying to accomplish, but we've also got to have the right heart about it. You talked about, do we want to influence for a position or for extra pay or whatever? There are times for that, But if that's our motivation for influence, we probably are going to fail at it, because our influence has to be genuine for others, not for our own benefit and gain.
And I think that is part of what was wrapped up in the old model, is that it was for personal gain. And look, I love making money. I'm
Yeah.
not looking down my nose at anybody who wants to make money,
Exactly.
but you can do it by doing the right thing. And in the book, I even talk about, this word influencer, that everybody thinks if you're an influencer, it means, Kardashian style influencer.
Right.
And there's business models for that, but that's not what there's also the people like Tim Tebow, who, was an athlete, but now he's using this huge platform to advocate for his faith and the topics that he's deeply passionate about. He is an influencer in a conversation that is important. It's not tied to monetary. He's not an ambassador necessarily in the way that we think of other influencers. So it gets a little muddied when we get into social media. But if, as you said, if your heart is there and you're letting people know unapologetically what you stand for, the right people follow you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to ask you a personal question. You shared about your 20 years in the corporate and then transition into this, and you've been blessed now with your 7th book. You're in 30 different countries. What have you learned, especially like in the last 4 to 5 years, coming out of COVID, and how things are changing and how you now have influence, right? Because it's not just about starting or gaining influence. Sometimes we have it and it may be vast. How do we, I almost said manage it. It's not about managing it. How do we use that larger platform effectively? And how have you navigated that, Lida?
Oh, that's a tough one. The first thing that comes to mind is when I sat with this new publisher that I'm with, and they said, don't write another business book. And I've written business books, like how to do something. They said, write a book from your heart that you think the world needs now. And I'd never been tasked with that. I think had I been given that prompt 5 years ago, I would have had no idea what to do with it. I had to make myself vulnerable in this book. I had to share things I'm not proud of because I'm asking my readers to do things like that. I'm asking them to have courage. I had to have courage. I'm asking them to be real. I have to be real. And I, over the last probably 4 years, have really been leaning into that. And it is downright terrifying. I wholly appreciate when somebody says, what? But the first rule is courage. And I have to lead by example, which does make it a little bit of pressure, right? Pressure here. And I make mistakes and I have to own them and I have to learn from them and I have to talk about them. But I also am a big fan of authenticity, but not transparency. So what I have learned a lot is that we don't have to be transparent. I don't have to jump into every social media conversation on every volatile topic that shows up. Where is that written? There's this peer pressure that's showing up in group conversations and in social media that says, we need to hear from you. Well, maybe, but maybe not. And a lot of my clients have struggled with that. And I've watched them navigate when, a Supreme Court decision comes down and they're getting pressure from their board of directors to have an opinion. And they're saying, wait a minute, there's trauma for me around that. Why do I have to open that vein and share it for people I don't even know? And so that I believe in being real. If you ask me an honest question, I'm going to answer it genuinely. But I also reserve the right to say, I'm not comfortable answering that. And I think that's how I keep myself safe. I know how far over my skis I can go and still stretch and still be a little uncomfortable and still be real. But I also, there are certain things that just aren't anybody's business. They're not germane to my brand. And I can be somebody of influence and teach that, because I think we get into trouble when we think we have to be transparent.
Yeah, I like the way you articulated that, even for a reason you didn't describe right there. But there are a lot of new leaders who are elevating, who hear about transparency, right? And they think, I have to let people know all about my dogs and my cats and my kids' games and things. And yes, we want to have relationships with people we lead, but that's not really the full essence of it. Vulnerability-based leadership is just really, it's owning my mistakes, owning my own path, having real conversations with people. And now I appreciate the way you articulate that, because I know a lot of the clients that we coach, they struggle with that. They want to be an authentic leader, but they don't want to share every bit of their life.
And I say set up guardrails, right? Where are the boundaries of topics you don't go to, right? I have clients that have small children. They're like, I don't want to post about them on social media. It makes me uncomfortable. Then don't. Then there's a boundary for you, or a guardrail. I don't talk politics at all. Mm-hmm. I don't talk drugs and alcohol. Right? You don't see me engaged in conversations or sharing pictures of those topics. Mm-hmm. It doesn't mean I don't have strong opinions about politics or I don't enjoy a glass of wine on a Friday afternoon. But I have clients in recovery and I'm just being sensitive. It's not part of my brand. I don't need to go there to be me. And same thing with politics. I have very strong opinions, but they're mine and I don't have to share them. Yep. And I think when we start doing that, we start claiming that, then we're freer to share the parts of us that we do want to talk about. Mm-hmm. I'm happy to talk about my kids. I'm happy to talk about how I grew up in my childhood. I'm happy to talk about those things because I know where the guardrails are. And for the leaders you're coaching, it's just setting those up so that they can feel safe, sharing more about themselves in ways that are authentic. And I do think when it comes to things like government or even some aspects of business, transparency is warranted, right? We should understand how you got to the requisite that you're making for this additional budget. I need to see your math. I want to see transparency. But with people, it's tricky. I do a lot of reputation repair work. And oftentimes it's someone who went out too far and then tried to take it back. You just don't get to put the genie back in the bottle, as they say.
Yeah. So talk about that for a minute, because I know we all make mistakes. Sometimes they're very public, sometimes they're not. But this whole idea of reputation repair, where there's negative perceptions of us, whether from something we did or didn't do, right? Perceptions can be out there that are negative. How do you go about this reputation management, brand repair?
Well, and you hit on a really important point for your listeners. Perception exists. Biases, stereotypes, judgments, beliefs, opinions, people have them. And they have them of us even before meeting us. Where personal branding and reputation management give you the tools is to be in front of that, to manage that, to drive it to the point where you want it to be. And again, that has to be based in truth. Reputation repair comes in when somebody has made a mistake, or, as you point out, wrong place, wrong time. Mm-hmm. And those are the heartbreaking cases. They really are. Somebody thought they were doing the right thing. That's what they were told. And now they're in the crosshairs. They crush my heart to hear that, because these are people really trying to do something good. Scapegoats, all of that. There's definitely some protocols. No two situations are exactly the same. If it's a social media play, that can have some different protocols. If somebody's job's at stake, or community is at risk, they're all different levers that we use. But the first thing to do is pause. Because what people tend to do is they make more mistakes in those moments. They take all their social media down. They start apologizing. It's kind of like, you don't want to start confessing to things that you don't have to confess to, but just take a pause and get your bearings. And then figure out what the go forward plan is. Sometimes it is an apology tour. That's what one of my clients called it, which I thought that was a funny way to call it, but they did. They went around and apologized to all the people who'd been impacted. Wow. Sometimes it is about going on social media and making a public statement. Sometimes it is showing people what you've learned. People make mistakes. We do things we think in the moment are going to be okay, and later realize that was really stupid. And I've worked with clients who've done Title IX violations in universities, or doctors who've, crossed the lines with patients. And my first thought, the question I first ask is, how do you feel about what happened? And if somebody says, well, I just want it to go away. I mean, everybody makes mistakes. Right. Probably not a client I'm excited about working with. When they want a second chance, they want to make it right, they want to show that that's not really who they are, there's something to work with. Yeah.
So with your clients, just because our listeners may want to take advantage of your services, what you just described in the last few minutes, obviously, is kind of like that crisis aspect, right? And
Right.
reputation repair. But I know that a lot of what you're building out here truly is influence. It's about credibility. It's about your personal brand. With your work as a coach, like how much is on each side of that equation?
I would say that it's heavier on proactive personal branding. It's emotionally taxing to work with people who are in crisis, who are in triage situations. So I'm very selective in those. Culturally, it becomes very interesting because I've worked in various different cultures and it plays out differently. Even if it's a social media infraction, it plays out differently culturally, depending on where their company is.
Mm-hmm.
Most of my work is proactive, but I'll take a few cases a year, 3 to 4 cases a year of people. And some of these are very high profile individuals. Yeah.
But a lot of it then is that building that personal brand. I like that. So I know we have to understand ourselves, understand who we are as a leader, understand who we are to impact other people to truly have that influence. So I'm glad you're coaching there. So I'm going to ask you a crazy question. I'm going to ask you to look forward. Okay. You just wrote the book, The New Rules of Influence.
Mm-hmm.
What's like that next thing that's coming that people aren't talking about yet when it comes to brand and influence?
Oh my. You're going to patent an idea, aren't you? You ask all your
It's
guests.
your idea. It's your idea, not mine.
Oh, I think there's going to be a right sizing between transparency and authenticity. I think especially in the leadership ranks. We see business leaders, CEOs, very high visibility people making mistakes because they're, as you mentioned, they're leaning into this transparency, erroneously. Right. So I think there's going to be a right sizing. I look forward to a time when we can talk about things and not always get upset about them. When both sides of the conversation have equal value and merit. I don't know that exists today. I look forward to that. And I look forward to when somebody can really lean into that influence and they don't yet have the job title. When they're in the back of the room raising their hand going, but wait a minute, something here doesn't make sense. Or I've got a great idea. And then they actually come to the front of the room and they start to have more of that. I think personal branding is continuing to grow. I think we've realized how valuable and accessible it is. Mm-hmm. I talk about it in different countries now, and it used to only be an American thing. The military is talking about it. We see these groups that were so anything but, self-promotion, really starting to embrace it. And I think that makes the world a better place. We're more intentional about how we show up.
Absolutely. One more question you just made me think of with that. I know a lot of business owners, because we have a lot of business owners listening, are really investing themselves in developing the brand of their company.
Yep.
But simultaneously, they need a personal brand. And there's just this struggle with that of understanding how do I push the business and grow the biz, but yet it's about me or my personal brand in different aspects. How would you help somebody navigate that?
It's very common. You're absolutely correct. It's common for someone who works for a company to want to build the company brand. But when it's the founder or the business owner, you're right. I want the focus to be on the business. The challenge with that is, what if one day you sell the business? Now who are you? Right. And I deal with a lot of executives who, come away from their company, or business owners, entrepreneurs who are onto their next thing. And how do you take the value assets from that first business? And I mean reputation value assets, and bring them forward. When you have a strong leader who has a strong brand, and then the leadership team and the employees and everybody has their own brand, and you have a company brand, they're not mutually exclusive. They should complement beautifully. Your customers coming to the front door and meeting the reception person sees that brand right there in the person that they meet with. Their sales executive, everyone that they experience in that company should reflect the same brand values and attributes as the CEO, as the company. And that's where we see businesses really thrive. And they build brand loyalty, and individuals build brand loyalty. And as you and I know, it's not happy customers, it's loyal customers. Yeah. And they're the ones that'll tell everybody about you. So yes, as a business owner, you need a personal brand. You don't get away with not having it.
I like it. It's the yes and, right? Personal brand for the benefit of the company brand and vice versa. Yeah. So great stuff. Well, listeners, in the show notes today, you can find links to Lida on social. You'll find links to her books, and you can tap into that. I'd really encourage you to pick up the New Rules of Influence. But Lida, I have one more question for you. We finish every episode of the podcast with the same question, a quick tip. What is something our listeners can do intentionally today to lead more effectively?
Speak up. Don't wait for someone else to offer the idea. And if they do, build on it. Make your voice heard. Be the first one to raise your hand, and the fear of judgment will be there, but take the risk, because that's how things get moved forward. And that's being intentional. Take a chance.
Love it. Right back to the courage. Thank you.
Yep.
Fantastic. Well, Lida, it's been great having you on the show. Thank you for being an intentional leader and intentional author and coach. And we hope that you are continuing to be blessed in your business all around the world.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Intentional Leader Podcast presented by Reenergize Professional Coaching. Be sure to see the show notes for links to Reenergize Professional Coaching and links to contact our guests. Now, hit that subscribe button so that you are alerted with every new episode of the Intentional Leader Podcast.